When my husband's business partners applauded as he announced he was quitting his executive position to find himself, and expected me to carry all our expenses on my teacher's salary, I smiled and thanked him for finally showing everyone exactly who he was. What I did next made every single person in that conference room realize they had severely underestimated the quiet woman in the corner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I am stopping my job. You will maintain us while I get my life together. Those words appeared on my phone screen at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was standing in front of 28 fifth graders trying to explain long division. The text message came from my husband of 9 years, Marcus Brennan, sent not as a question or a request for discussion, but as a simple statement of fact. An announcement of a decision he had made unilaterally that would fundamentally alter our financial situation, our household dynamic, and apparently my role in our marriage. I stared at those words while my students worked through practice problems in their workbooks, the classroom filled with the sound of pencils scratching against paper, and the occasional whispered question between desk partners. My hands had gone cold despite the warmth of the May afternoon streaming through the tall windows of Roosevelt Elementary School. I read the message 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding something, searching for context or explanation that would make the words mean something different than what they so clearly stated. There was no context, no explanation, just that single declarative sentence followed by silence. I had left our house that morning at 6:45 after making breakfast for both of us, packing lunches, and managing the invisible choreography of getting 2 working adults ready and out the door on time. Marcus had been in excellent spirits, humming while he knotted his tie, mentioning something about an important presentation he was delivering to the executive team at Vertex Solutions, the biotechnology firm where he worked as director of business development. He had kissed me goodbye at the door, grabbed his coffee travel mug, and headed out to his Audi looking every inch the successful corporate professional in his tailored navy suit. 8 hours later, he was apparently no longer that person. He had transformed into someone who believed he could simply opt out of employment and financial responsibility, while his wife absorbed the burden of maintaining the lifestyle we had built together on 2 professional incomes. I managed to get through the remainder of the school day on autopilot, my mind spinning through implications while my mouth formed words about mathematics and spelling, and the importance of cleaning up the art station properly before dismissal. When the final bell rang and my students poured out into the hallway with their backpacks and their boundless energy, I sat at my desk and called Marcus. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice relaxed and almost cheerful. "Hey babe, got my message?" "What is happening, Marcus?" I kept my voice level despite the anxiety coursing through my system. "What does your text mean?" "Exactly what it says." He sounded almost amused by my confusion. "I quit today. Walked into Gerald's office right after the presentation and told him I was done. Turned in my badge, cleaned out my desk, the whole thing. Felt amazing, honestly. Like this weight just lifted off my shoulders." "You quit your job." I repeated the words slowly, trying to make them feel real. "Without discussing it with me first. Without any plan for what comes next." "I have a plan," Marcus said, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his tone. "The plan is that I take some time to figure out what I actually want to do with my life, instead of grinding away at a corporate job that is slowly killing my soul. I have been miserable, Maya. I need space to breathe and think and explore other options." "How long is some time?" I asked, already knowing I would not like the answer. "I do not know. 6 months, maybe a year. However long it takes." He paused, then added with what sounded like genuine confusion about why this might be a problem. "You make enough to cover our basics, right? I mean, it is not like we will starve. We just need to cut back on some of the extras for a while." "Our basics." I did a rapid mental calculation of our monthly expenses while Marcus continued talking about how corporate culture was toxic and how he needed to reconnect with his authentic self. The mortgage payment on our 3-bedroom house in Riverside Hills was $3,200. My monthly take-home pay as a 5th-grade teacher with 7 years of experience was approximately $4,100 after taxes, health insurance, and retirement contributions. That left exactly $900 for utilities, groceries, car payments, insurance, credit card minimums, student loans, and every other expense required to maintain our existence. Marcus, the math does not work, I said, interrupting his monologue about authentic living. My salary alone cannot cover our mortgage and basic expenses, let alone any extras. We structured our lifestyle based on 2 incomes. You know this. Then we will adjust, he said simply, as though reducing household spending by 60% was a minor inconvenience rather than a fundamental restructuring of our lives. Eat at home more, cut the streaming services, maybe you pick up some tutoring on the side. People do it all the time, Maya. You are acting like I am suggesting something crazy when really I am just asking my wife to support me the way I supported you through grad school. That comparison landed like a physical blow. I had attended a 1-year master's program in education while working full-time as a teaching assistant, taking evening classes, and contributing every cent of my assistantship stipend to our household expenses. Marcus had supported me in the sense that he had not complained about my limited availability during that year, but his salary had continued uninterrupted and our lifestyle had not changed in any meaningful way, suggesting that my completing graduate school while maintaining employment was equivalent to him quitting his 6-figure job, and expecting me to somehow stretch my teacher's salary across all our obligations was not just inaccurate. It was insulting. We need to talk about this in person, I said finally, recognizing that this conversation was not going to resolve anything over the phone. Are you home? I am actually meeting some of the guys for drinks, Marcus said, celebrating my liberation. I will be back later tonight. We can talk then if you want, but honestly, Maya, the decision is made. I need you to be supportive here instead of immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. He disconnected before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my empty classroom with afternoon sunlight slanting across student desks, and the faint smell of dry erase markers hanging in the air. I looked around at the space where I spent my days teaching children how to think critically, how to solve problems, how to advocate for themselves. The irony was not lost on me that I apparently needed to apply those same lessons to my own life. I drove home through familiar streets lined with oak trees and well-maintained houses, my mind cataloging everything I knew about our financial situation, and finding the picture increasingly alarming. Marcus and I had been living comfortably but not extravagantly on our combined income of approximately $170,000 annually. His salary alone represented nearly 2/3 of that total. We had some savings, perhaps $15,000 in our joint account, but that would evaporate rapidly if we were relying on my income alone for mortgage payments and basic expenses. Our house was a beautiful 3-bedroom Craftsman we had purchased 4 years earlier, stretching our budget because Marcus insisted we needed to live in the right neighborhood for future career networking and eventual children. The mortgage was higher than I had been comfortable with, but Marcus had been confident about his earning trajectory and had convinced me the investment would prove worthwhile. Now that earning trajectory had apparently ended with him quitting to find himself, and I would be responsible for payments we had only been able to afford as a dual-income household. The house was empty when I arrived, which gave me time to actually look at our financial records without Marcus hovering over my shoulder questioning why I was being so negative. I opened our laptop and pulled up our banking information, credit card statements, and the household budget spreadsheet I had created 2 years earlier when I had first started feeling anxious about our spending patterns. The spreadsheet told a story I had been trying to ignore. Over the past 18 months, our expenses had increased substantially while our income remained relatively flat. Marcus had purchased the Audi, insisting he needed a vehicle that projected success to clients and colleagues. He had joined an exclusive gym that cost $290 per month because the standard gym lacked the right atmosphere and equipment. He had upgraded his wardrobe significantly, explaining that appearance mattered in business development and that his previous clothes were not sufficiently impressive. I had questioned these expenses at the time, suggesting that perhaps we should be building savings rather than expanding our lifestyle, but Marcus had dismissed my concerns with assurances that his career was on an upward trajectory and that we needed to invest in the image of success to achieve actual success. I had deferred to his judgment because he was the one with the corporate career and the business development expertise. Clearly that had been a mistake. I was still reviewing financial documents when Marcus came home shortly after 9, smelling of craft beer and expensive cologne. He was in an expansive mood, energized rather than exhausted, clearly viewing his employment termination as liberation rather than crisis. "You are still looking at that stuff?" He gestured toward the laptop with mild annoyance. Come on, Maya. Let it go for tonight. Everything will work out. It always does. We need to make an actual plan, I said, keeping my voice calm despite my growing frustration. You have made a major decision that affects both of us. Now we need to figure out how we are going to manage the practical implications. Marcus sighed and dropped onto the couch beside me, his expression suggesting I was being unnecessarily difficult about something simple. The plan is that you keep working, I take some time to figure out my next move, and we tighten our belts for a while. That is it. That is the whole plan. Why are you making this so complicated? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Because the math does not work, I repeated, turning the laptop so he could see the spreadsheet displaying our monthly expenses and income. Look at these numbers. My salary covers the mortgage and maybe half of our other expenses. Where does the rest come from? We cut expenses, Marcus said with the confidence of someone who had never actually managed a household budget. Cancel subscriptions, eat cheaper food, stop buying unnecessary things. Problem solved. I pulled up another tab showing our credit card statements. We are already carrying $8,000 in credit card debt from the past 6 months. That is with both of us working. If we cut my income by 2/3 and somehow manage to reduce our spending enough to not go deeper into debt, we will still have no money for emergencies, repairs, medical expenses, or any unexpected costs. One car problem or health issue and we are in serious financial crisis. Then I will find some part-time work, Marcus said, his frustration now matching my own. Drive for a rideshare company or do some consulting. I am not saying I will do nothing, Maya. I am just saying I need a break from the corporate grind. Why is that so hard for you to accept? Because you made this decision without consulting me, I wanted to say. Because you have structured this as an announcement rather than a discussion. Because you are framing your choice to abandon financial responsibility as something I need to support rather than something we need to decide together. Because your plan requires me to absorb all the stress and burden while you explore yourself. What I actually said was, when you say you need time to figure out your next move, what does that mean specifically? What are you planning to do during this break? Marcus's expression shifted into something vaguely defensive. I do not know yet. That is the whole point. I need space to explore options without the pressure of corporate deadlines and politics. Maybe I will take some online courses, work on that novel I have been thinking about, spend time on personal development. The specifics are not important. What is important is that I have the freedom to figure it out without you constantly questioning whether I am being productive enough. The novel he had been thinking about. I had heard him mention this idea exactly twice in 9 years of marriage, both times after drinking wine and watching a biographical film about a successful author. He had never written a single page of actual fiction, never taken a creative writing course, never demonstrated any sustained interest in the craft beyond vague statements about how he probably had a book in him somewhere. Now apparently this phantom novel was justification for quitting his job and expecting me to finance an indefinite period of self-discovery. I need to understand what we are committing to, I said carefully. If this is 6 months, that is one calculation. If it is a year or longer, that is a completely different situation. I cannot plan or adjust without knowing what timeline we are working with. And I cannot give you an exact timeline because I do not know, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. That is what you are not getting. I need flexibility. I need space. I need support, not interrogation. I thought my wife would be happy that I am finally prioritizing mental health and personal fulfillment over a paycheck, but apparently you care more about money than about my well-being. The argument was skillfully constructed to make any objection I raised sound unsupportive or materialistic. If I pushed back on the lack of planning, I was being controlling. If I expressed concern about finances, I was prioritizing money over his happiness. If I questioned the wisdom of quitting without a clear alternative plan, I was not trusting him or believing in his capabilities. Every angle of reasonable concern was preemptively reframed as a personal failure on my part to be the supportive partner he deserved. I recognized the technique because I had seen it before in our marriage, though never deployed quite so comprehensively. Marcus had a pattern of presenting his desires as needs and my hesitation as betrayal. When he wanted the expensive car, My budget concerns became lack of faith in his career prospects. When he wanted the costly gym membership, my questions became resistance to his health and fitness goals. When he wanted to spend substantial amounts on wardrobe updates, my suggestions about saving instead became lack of understanding about professional image requirements. Each time I had eventually acquiesced because the alternative was extended conflict and the suggestion that I was somehow failing as a supportive partner. Each time I had told myself that compromise was healthy, and that his needs were legitimate even if I had concerns about implementation. Each time, I had absorbed more financial stress and more household management burden while Marcus pursued whatever he had decided was necessary for his growth or success or satisfaction. This time felt different. This time the stakes were not discretionary spending, but fundamental financial stability. This time the commitment was not a purchase, but a complete restructuring of our life that would place me under enormous pressure, while Marcus explored undefined personal goals on an indefinite timeline. "I am going to bed," I said finally, closing the laptop because continuing this conversation was clearly not going to produce understanding or resolution. "We can talk more tomorrow when we have both had time to think." "There is nothing more to think about," Marcus said, but his tone had shifted slightly, uncertainty creeping in around the edges of his confidence. "The decision is made. I need you to get on board." I went upstairs without responding, my mind already working through calculations and possibilities I had not wanted to seriously consider. Our marriage had been showing cracks for at least 2 years, maybe longer if I was honest with myself about the timeline. This text message and Marcus's subsequent handling of what should have been a mutual decision was not an isolated incident. It was the most dramatic example of a pattern that had been establishing itself gradually over the entire course of our relationship. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept soundly beside me, apparently unburdened by concerns about mortgage payments or household expenses, or the unilateral restructuring of our marital partnership. The text message was still on my phone, those words glowing in the darkness when I opened the screen. "I am stopping my job. You will maintain us while I get my life together." Not "we need to discuss my career dissatisfaction." Not "I am thinking about making a change and want to plan together." Not "how can we adjust our life so I have more freedom while we maintain stability." Just a simple announcement of what he had decided, and what I would now be required to do. I thought about my students, those 28 fifth graders who looked to me to teach them not just mathematics and reading but how to navigate the world. I thought about the lessons I tried to instill about self-advocacy, and setting boundaries and recognizing when someone was not treating you with appropriate respect. I thought about how I would respond if one of those students came to me describing a relationship where their needs were consistently dismissed, and their concerns were reframed as personal failings. I would tell that student they deserved better. I would tell them that real partnership requires mutual respect and shared decision-making. I would tell them that loving someone does not mean accepting treatment that diminishes your worth or ignores your legitimate needs. The question was whether I was prepared to apply that same standard to my own life. I fell asleep sometime after midnight with no answers but with growing certainty that I could not simply accept what Marcus had decided. His text message had been framed as an announcement, but it was actually an opening move in a negotiation he did not realize was happening. He believed his decision was final because he had always been able to present his desires as accomplished facts, and I had always eventually accommodated them. This time would be different. This time I would not absorb the burden without question. This time I would require actual partnership instead of accepting the role of supporting actor in Marcus's narrative of self-discovery. But first I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed information about our complete financial situation, about Marcus's actual plans if any existed beyond vague statements about finding himself, about whether this employment termination was truly about career dissatisfaction, or whether something else was motivating his sudden need for undefined time and space. I did not know it yet, but that investigation would reveal far more than I anticipated. Marcus's text message about stopping his job and expecting me to maintain us while he got his life together was not the complete truth about what was happening. It was actually a carefully constructed partial truth, designed to establish a new arrangement that would serve purposes I had not yet discovered. The real story was much worse, and uncovering it would require patience, strategy, and a willingness to question everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my husband. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and engaging with stories about resilience, strategic thinking, and reclaiming personal power. If you believe that careful planning and quiet strength can triumph over manipulation and betrayal, please consider subscribing. It helps us reach more people who need these stories of transformation and accountability. Now let us see how everything unfolds. Marcus woke the next morning with the same relaxed energy that had characterized his mood the previous evening, apparently expecting that our conversation was finished and that I had accepted the new reality he had established. He spent the morning in our home office with the door closed, doing something on his computer that he described as research when I knocked to ask if he wanted lunch. Research for what? I asked, genuinely curious about what specific activities were consuming his first full day of unemployment. Just exploring possibilities, he said vaguely, his eyes not leaving his screen. Looking into different career paths, checking out some courses, that kind of thing. Nothing concrete yet. I made lunch for both of us. A simple pasta dish using ingredients we already had, because I was acutely aware that grocery shopping would need to become much more strategic if we were truly living on my salary alone. Marcus ate quickly while scrolling through his phone, then returned to the office without offering to help clean up or discussing any specifics about what he had been researching all morning. The afternoon brought our first real test of the new financial arrangement. Marcus emerged from the office around 3 and announced he was going to the gym. I thought we agreed we needed to cut expenses, I said carefully. Your gym membership is almost $300 a month. That seems like an obvious thing to cancel if we are tightening our budget. Marcus looked at me as though I had suggested something absurd. I need the gym, Maya. Physical fitness is crucial for mental health, especially during a transition period. Canceling my membership would be counterproductive. There are other gyms that cost a fraction of that amount, I pointed out. Or you could run outside, use home workout videos, find alternatives that do not require such a substantial monthly payment. Those are not real solutions, Marcus said dismissively. The equipment and atmosphere at Elevation Fitness are what I need. This is non-negotiable. If we need to cut expenses, find something else. He left before I could respond, apparently considering the matter settled. I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop and began making a comprehensive list of our monthly subscriptions and recurring expenses, identifying everything that could potentially be reduced or eliminated. Marcus's gym membership was one of the largest discretionary expenses we had, but according to him it was non-negotiable. His car payment was another significant cost, but the Audi was leased and breaking the lease early would likely involve penalties. His premium auto insurance was higher than mine because of the vehicle value. His clothing budget, his streaming services, his various subscriptions to business publications and online platforms. I began to recognize a pattern. The expenses Marcus considered non-negotiable were almost exclusively his own. The cuts he was proposing would come primarily from my significantly smaller discretionary spending, and from household expenses that affected both of us equally. He was proposing that we maintain his lifestyle while dramatically reducing mine under the framework of shared sacrifice. That evening I received a call from my sister Lauren, who lived 2 hours away in Madison and whom I spoke with several times a week. She immediately sensed something was wrong from my tone despite my attempts to sound normal. "What happened?" she asked after less than 5 minutes of superficial conversation. "Something is going on. I can hear it in your voice." I explained about Marcus's text message, his announcement that he had quit his job, his expectation that I would support us financially while he took indefinite time to find himself. Lauren listened without interrupting, her silence communicating volumes about what she was thinking. "Maya," she said finally, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering news they know will not be well received. "When a man quits his job without discussion and immediately frames it as his wife's obligation to support him while he explores undefined personal goals, that is not about career transition. That is about something else. You need to find out what else is happening here." "What do you mean?" I asked, though some part of me already understood what she was suggesting. "I mean that in my experience, when someone suddenly needs space and time and freedom with no clear explanation beyond vague statements about finding themselves, they are usually either running from something or running toward something. And whatever they are running from or toward, they are not being honest about it." Lauren paused, then added gently, "I am not saying Marcus is definitely hiding something. I am saying the circumstances are suspicious enough that you would be smart to verify what he is telling you rather than just accepting it at face value. The suggestion landed uncomfortably because it required me to admit that I did not fully trust my husband's explanation for his behavior. It required acknowledging that Marcus might be deliberately deceiving me rather than simply being thoughtless or self-absorbed about a career decision. It required me to consider that our marriage might be in more serious trouble than I had been willing to recognize. How would I even verify anything? I asked. I cannot exactly interrogate him. He is already defensive about my asking basic questions about his plans. You do not interrogate, Lauren said. You observe. You pay attention. You document. And if you find evidence that things are not what he is claiming, then you make decisions based on actual information rather than the story he wants you to believe. We talked for another 40 minutes, with Lauren asking detailed questions about our financial situation, Marcus's recent behavior patterns, and whether I had noticed any other changes that might be relevant. The conversation forced me to actually review the past several months rather than just accepting the general sense that things had been fine, and the review was illuminating in uncomfortable ways. Marcus had been working longer hours than usual for the past 4 or 5 months, frequently claiming evening meetings or client dinners that required him to stay late or go out after the normal workday ended. His explanation had been that he was positioning himself for promotion, and that increased face time with senior executives and key clients was necessary for advancement. I had accepted this explanation because it was consistent with what I understood about corporate culture and career development. But now, viewing those months through a more skeptical lens, I recognized that Marcus's stories about where he had been and what he had been doing had been oddly vague. He rarely mentioned specific names of colleagues or clients he had supposedly been meeting with. He never invited me to join him for the social portions of these evening obligations, even when that would have been appropriate. He had become increasingly protective of his phone, always keeping it with him and positioning it face down on surfaces so notifications were not visible. Lauren encouraged me to trust my instincts, to recognize that I knew Marcus better than anyone else, and that if something felt wrong about his explanation and behavior, I should take that feeling seriously rather than dismissing it as paranoia or distrust. After we disconnected, I sat with my laptop and began creating a document to track Marcus's daily activities, his stated plans, his actual whereabouts if I could verify them, and any inconsistencies between what he claimed and what I observed. I felt simultaneously guilty for essentially surveilling my own husband and validated that taking such precautions was reasonable given the circumstances. The document was practical and methodical, organized by date with columns for stated plans, actual observations, expenses incurred, and notes about anything that seemed inconsistent or unusual. I titled it simply Household Planning, and saved it to my personal cloud storage account that Marcus had no access to, then cleared my browser history out of an abundance of caution I had not previously thought necessary in my own home. Marcus came home after 7 that evening, explaining he had met up with a former colleague for coffee after the gym to discuss potential opportunities. He was in good spirits, clearly energized by whatever conversation he had engaged in, and he seemed genuinely surprised when I asked for details about what had been discussed. Just general stuff, he said with a slightly defensive edge to his tone. What is happening in the industry, what kind of roles might be interesting, whether he knows of any openings. Networking basically. Why are you asking? I am trying to understand your plan, I said, keeping my voice neutral. You said you need time to figure out your next move. I am asking what specific steps you are taking toward that goal. And I am taking them, Marcus replied, his frustration becoming more evident. I have been home less than 2 full days and you are already monitoring my activities like I am accountable to you for every hour. This is exactly the kind of pressure I was trying to get away from. I need you to back off and let me handle this my own way. The irony of him demanding that I back off while simultaneously requiring that I financially support his undefined exploration was apparently lost on him. I did not point this out because I was beginning to understand that direct confrontation was not going to produce honest information. If Marcus was hiding something beyond simple career dissatisfaction, pushing him would only make him more defensive and more careful about what he shared. Instead, I needed to become more strategic about how I approached understanding what was actually happening. I needed to observe rather than interrogate, to document rather than confront, to build a clear picture based on evidence rather than accepting explanations that felt increasingly inadequate. That night marked a shift in my approach to the situation Marcus had created. I stopped trying to convince him that his decision was problematic or that his expectations were unreasonable. I stopped expressing my concerns about finances or asking for clarity about his plans. On the surface, I appeared to accept the new arrangement he had established, becoming the supportive wife he claimed to need. But beneath that surface acceptance, I was beginning an investigation that would eventually reveal that Marcus's text message about stopping his job and needing time to get his life together was only a small portion of a much larger story. A story that involved deception far beyond what I had initially suspected, decisions that affected our future in ways I had not been informed about, and a plan that Marcus had been developing for months without any intention of consulting me. The investigation would take time and patience and a willingness to question everything I thought I knew. But it would also provide me with the information and evidence I needed to make decisions based on truth, rather than accepting a version of reality that Marcus had carefully constructed for his own benefit. My journey from the shock teacher reading a text message about her husband quitting his job to the strategic woman who would eventually turn the tables on Marcus's expectations started in those first few days after his announcement. It started with recognizing that something was not adding up, with trusting my instincts that his explanation was incomplete, and with making the decision to discover truth rather than accepting convenient lies. What I would discover would change everything. And the confrontation that eventually occurred would take place not in our living room but in front of an audience Marcus never anticipated, at a moment when he believed he had successfully manipulated circumstances to his advantage, at the precise instant when his confidence was highest and his guard was lowest. But that confrontation was still months away. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. First, I needed to gather evidence that would make denial impossible. First, I needed to transform from the accommodating wife who absorbed whatever her husband decided into someone capable of strategic response and comprehensive accountability. The transformation would require everything I had. But it would also prove that quiet strength and patient preparation could achieve outcomes that dramatic confrontation never could. The story of how Marcus Brennan and I built our life together began 7 years before that text message arrived. In a coffee shop near the University of Wisconsin campus where I was completing my teaching certification, and he was finishing an MBA program that promised to launch him into corporate success. The meeting was accidental in the way many significant encounters are. Neither of us looking for relationship, but both of us finding something that felt right in that moment. I had been sitting at a corner table grading practice essays from my student teaching placement, red pen moving across papers filled with the earnest but unpolished writing of third graders learning to construct paragraphs. Marcus had asked if he could share my table since the shop was crowded with students seeking caffeine and quiet space during finals week. We had started talking during a break in my grading, discovering we were both from small towns in the Midwest, both the first in our families to complete graduate degrees, both driven by ambitions that felt simultaneously exciting and overwhelming. Marcus had been charismatic from that first conversation, the kind of person who made you feel like you were the most interesting individual in the room when his attention focused on you. He asked thoughtful questions about my teaching philosophy, and genuinely seemed to care about my perspectives on education reform and the challenges facing public schools. He shared his own background, growing up in a working-class family in rural Iowa where his father had worked factory jobs and his mother had cleaned houses, both of them sacrificing to ensure Marcus could attend college and escape the economic limitations that had constrained their own lives. He spoke about business and career advancement with the passion some people reserve for art or music, describing corporate success as something he could achieve through strategic thinking and relentless effort. He had internship experience at a regional pharmaceutical company and had already received a job offer from Vertex Solutions, a growing biotechnology firm based in our city that was developing innovative treatments for autoimmune disorders. The position was in business development, which Marcus explained meant he would be responsible for identifying partnership opportunities and helping to commercialize the therapies the company was creating. His enthusiasm had been infectious. He made corporate success sound like something noble rather than mercenary, framing his ambitions as wanting to prove that someone from his background could compete with people who had grown up with advantages and connections. He wanted to build something significant, to earn enough that his parents could retire comfortably, to demonstrate that intelligence and drive could overcome lack of privilege. These were goals I understood and respected, having my own version of similar aspirations about proving that public school teachers could be intellectually serious professionals rather than glorified babysitters. We had exchanged numbers that afternoon, and Marcus had called 2 days later to ask if I wanted to have dinner. That first date had stretched into 4 hours of conversation at a Thai restaurant near campus, covering everything from childhood experiences to career goals to our respective views on politics and culture, and what constituted a meaningful life. Marcus had been attentive and engaged, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. The relationship developed quickly from that foundation. Within 3 months we were spending most evenings together, alternating between his small apartment near the business school and my even smaller studio closer to campus. Marcus would come to my student teaching classroom during my lunch break, bringing sandwiches and asking about my day with genuine interest. I would attend his networking events and case study presentations, playing the role of supportive partner, even though I understood little about business strategy and market analysis. When we both graduated that May, Marcus with his MBA and multiple job offers, me with my teaching certification and a position at Roosevelt Elementary starting in the fall, it felt natural to move in together. We found a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood halfway between my school and the Vertex Solutions headquarters where Marcus would be starting his corporate career. The apartment was small but sufficient, with enough space for both of us to work from home when needed and close enough to our respective jobs that commuting was manageable. Those early years of our relationship had contained genuine partnership in ways that became harder to remember once the dynamic shifted. We had cooked together, splitting grocery costs and taking turns planning meals. We had maintained separate bank accounts but contributed equally to rent and shared expenses, each of us paying our proportionate share based on our respective incomes. We had made decisions together about furniture purchases and weekend plans, and whether we could afford to visit our families for holidays. Marcus's starting salary at Vertex had been substantially higher than my teacher's pay, but he had not used that differential to claim authority over household decisions or to suggest his career was more important than mine. He had been proud of my work as a teacher, telling his colleagues and friends about the curriculum innovations I was developing and the ways I was connecting with students who struggled in traditional educational environments. He had attended school events where my students performed or displayed their work, sitting in tiny chairs designed for elementary-age children and applauding enthusiastically. I had supported Marcus's career with equal investment. When he needed to attend evening networking events or weekend conferences, I had adjusted my schedule to accommodate his professional obligations. When he expressed frustration about difficult colleagues or challenging projects, I had listened and offered perspective and reminded him of his capabilities when he doubted himself. When he received promotions and salary increases, I had celebrated his success genuinely, viewing his advancement as beneficial for both of us rather than as something that diminished my own contributions. The decision to get married had emerged gradually rather than through dramatic proposal. After 3 years of living together, we had begun talking seriously about wanting to formalize our commitment and about timeline for potentially starting a family once we felt financially stable. Marcus had proposed during a weekend trip to Door County, presenting a ring he had carefully selected based on conversations with my sister Lauren about my preferences. The proposal had been private and personal, just the two of us on a quiet beach at sunset, his words focusing on partnership and shared future rather than romantic cliches about completing each other. We had married the following spring in a simple ceremony at a historic inn, surrounded by family and close friends but without the elaborate production that seemed to have become standard for weddings. The event had been lovely and intimate, focused on the commitment we were making rather than on impressing guests or creating social media content. Our vows had been traditional but sincere, promising to support each other through challenges and celebrate successes together, to maintain respect and communication even during difficult periods, to prioritize our partnership while also nurturing our individual growth. The early years of our marriage had largely fulfilled those promises. Marcus had advanced steadily at Vertex Solutions, moving from associate to senior associate to manager, and eventually to director level. Each promotion had brought salary increases that improved our financial situation and expanded our options for how we lived. We had moved from the small apartment to a modest house in a decent neighborhood, Then 3 years later to the larger home in Riverside Hills that represented our arrival at a level of success that had once seemed distant. I had contributed to that success in ways that were significant even if they were not financially equivalent to Marcus's corporate salary. My teacher's income had allowed us to save more of Marcus's earnings during the early years when establishing emergency funds and retirement accounts was crucial for long-term stability. My flexible schedule during summer months had enabled me to manage household responsibilities that would have required paid services if both of us had been working demanding corporate jobs year-round. My connections within the educational community had led to introduction opportunities that proved valuable for Marcus when Vertex began developing partnerships with school districts for health screenings and preventative care programs. Beyond practical contributions, I had provided the emotional support and stable home environment that allowed Marcus to focus his energy on career advancement without worrying about domestic chaos or relationship drama. I had created space where he could decompress from work stress, process frustrations with colleagues or superiors, and maintain perspective about setbacks that felt catastrophic in the moment, but were manageable with appropriate context. I had been his advocate and advisor, and sometimes his conscience when business decisions required weighing profit motives against ethical considerations. Marcus had appreciated these contributions during the first several years of our marriage, explicitly acknowledging that his success would not have been possible without the foundation we had built together. He had made a point of introducing me as his partner rather than just his wife at professional events, explaining to colleagues that I was an educator working to improve outcomes for disadvantaged students. He had defended my career choice when people made dismissive comments about teaching being a fallback profession for people who could not succeed in more competitive fields. But something had begun shifting approximately 2 years before the text message that would eventually reveal how dramatically our partnership had deteriorated. The changes had been gradual enough that I had convinced myself they were normal evolution, rather than warning signs of fundamental problems in how Marcus viewed our relationship and my role within it. The shift had started with small comments about lifestyle and image, Marcus suggesting that we needed to be more conscious about how we presented ourselves now that he was moving into senior leadership at Vertex. He had begun paying more attention to clothing and appearance, purchasing expensive suits and accessories that he claimed were necessary for projecting appropriate authority and success. He had insisted we upgrade from our reliable, but modest vehicles to cars that better reflected his professional status, leading to the lease on his Audi and pressure for me to replace my practical Honda with something more impressive. I had pushed back on some of these suggestions, pointing out that teachers could not realistically drive luxury vehicles without creating uncomfortable dynamics with colleagues and parents, and that my Honda was perfectly functional and paid off while a new car would mean taking on debt or reducing savings. Marcus had accused me of not understanding professional image requirements, claiming that people judged success based on visible markers, and that my resistance to upgrading our lifestyle was holding both of us back from the social circles we should be cultivating. The comment about holding us back had stung because it suggested my career and my values about appropriate spending were obstacles to overcome rather than legitimate perspectives to consider. But I had tried to view the statement charitably, telling myself that Marcus was under pressure at work, and that his focus on image was coming from insecurity rather than genuine belief that my choices were problematic. The lifestyle escalation had continued with Marcus joining the expensive gym, claiming he needed to maintain fitness and network with other professionals who used the facility. Then came the subscription services and the dining habits that assumed we could afford regular meals at upscale restaurants. The clothing budget had expanded to include not just work attire, but also casual wear that met Marcus's evolving standards for quality and brand recognition. Each individual expense had been justified through explanations about professional necessity or personal well-being, or the importance of enjoying life, rather than just saving for an uncertain future. I had questioned these expenses periodically, suggesting we needed to maintain some financial discipline even as Marcus's salary increased. But my concerns had been dismissed as being too focused on scarcity rather than abundance, too influenced by my modest upbringing rather than adapted to our improving circumstances, too risk-averse to embrace the lifestyle we had earned through our hard work. Marcus had made me feel like my financial caution was a personality flaw, rather than reasonable concern about sustainable spending patterns. Beyond the financial changes, Marcus's emotional availability had declined substantially. The man who had once asked detailed questions about my students and shown genuine interest in my teaching challenges had become someone who offered minimal engagement with my work life. When I shared stories about classroom successes or frustrations, Marcus would provide cursory acknowledgement before redirecting conversation to his own professional concerns. When I mentioned difficulties with administration or challenging parent interactions, he would offer generic advice about not taking things personally rather than actually discussing the specific situations I was navigating. Our conversations had become increasingly transactional, focused on logistics and schedules, rather than on substantive discussion of ideas or feelings or experiences. We coordinated who would handle grocery shopping and when bills needed to be paid, and whether we had plans for upcoming weekends, but we rarely talked about anything deeper than surface-level coordination of our separate lives that happened to share physical space. Physical intimacy had followed a similar declining trajectory. What had once been frequent and mutually satisfying had become occasional and somewhat perfunctory, as though Marcus was fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine desire or connection. When I had tried to discuss this change, Marcus had attributed it to work stress and exhaustion, promising it would improve once he got through whatever current project was consuming his energy. But the projects kept coming and the stress never seemed to abate, and the intimacy never returned to previous levels. I had tried multiple approaches to addressing these changes. I had suggested we schedule regular date nights to reconnect outside of household logistics. I had proposed we see a marriage counselor to work on communication patterns that seemed to be deteriorating. I had asked directly whether Marcus was happy in our marriage, and whether there were changes he wanted that we had not discussed. Each attempt had been met with resistance or dismissal, Marcus claiming we were fine and that I was overthinking normal fluctuations in long-term relationships. Looking back from the perspective of someone who had received that text message and was now questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage, I could see that Marcus had been systematically reducing his emotional investment in our partnership while simultaneously increasing his financial entitlement to lifestyle choices I was expected to support. He had been treating our relationship as something that existed primarily to serve his needs and ambitions, with my role being to provide support and resources without expecting reciprocal investment or consideration. The truly painful realization was recognizing how thoroughly I had accommodated this shift. I had absorbed his increasing emotional distance by telling myself that successful careers required intensive focus, and that temporary reduction in relationship attention was normal during demanding periods. I had accepted his spending escalation by deferring to his judgment about professional requirements despite my own concerns about sustainability. I had stopped pushing for marriage counseling or deeper conversations about our relationship, because his resistance made those discussions feel like battles I was too exhausted to fight. I had been conflict avoidant in ways that had ultimately empowered Marcus to establish a dynamic where his preferences dominated and my concerns were treated as problems to be managed rather than legitimate perspectives to be considered. I had prioritized relationship harmony over addressing legitimate grievances, and that choice had created permission for Marcus to continue behavior that was fundamentally disrespectful of our partnership. My sister Lauren had tried to point out these patterns on multiple occasions over the past year. During phone calls and visits, she had observed how Marcus spoke to me and about me, noting that his communication style had become dismissive and sometimes condescending. She had questioned why I seemed to be doing all the emotional labor in the relationship while Marcus focused exclusively on his own priorities. She had expressed concern that I was losing myself in efforts to be supportive while Marcus was becoming increasingly self-centered and entitled. I had defended Marcus during those conversations, explaining his work stress and his upbringing that had created insecurity about maintaining success once achieved. I had minimized my own concerns by framing them as normal relationship challenges rather than warning signs of deeper problems. I had been protecting the image of my marriage from scrutiny by someone whose observations were uncomfortably accurate. Now, sitting in my empty house while Marcus was out doing unspecified research or networking or whatever he was actually doing during his newfound freedom from employment, I was being forced to honestly evaluate what our marriage had become. The foundation we had built during those early years of genuine partnership had eroded substantially, replaced by a dynamic where I provided resources and support, while Marcus consumed both without reciprocal contribution or appreciation. His text message about stopping his job and expecting me to maintain us while he got his life together was not an aberration from an otherwise healthy relationship. It was the logical extension of patterns that had been establishing themselves for at least 2 years and possibly longer. Marcus had become accustomed to prioritizing his wants over our collective needs, to making unilateral decisions and expecting me to accommodate them, to viewing my resources and labor as available for his use without requiring consultation or appreciation. The realization was devastating because it meant acknowledging that I had been investing in a partnership that Marcus no longer viewed as reciprocal. It meant recognizing that the man I had married, who had seemed to value equality and mutual respect, had transformed into someone who expected service and support without offering equivalent investment. It meant confronting the possibility that our marriage might not be salvageable if Marcus was unwilling to recognize how dramatically his behavior had departed from the values we had supposedly shared. But the realization was also clarifying because it freed me from the obligation to keep making excuses and accommodations. If Marcus was going to treat our marriage as something that existed primarily to serve his agenda, then I was entitled to evaluate whether that arrangement was acceptable to me. If he was going to make unilateral decisions about employment and finances without consulting me, then I was entitled to make my own decisions about how to respond to circumstances he had created without my input. The partnership we had built during those early years had been real and valuable, which made its deterioration more painful but also provided a standard against which to measure how far we had fallen. I knew what healthy partnership looked like because I had experienced it. I knew what mutual respect and shared decision-making felt like because that had characterized our early marriage. The current state of our relationship was not inevitable evolution, but rather the result of choices Marcus had made about how to treat me, and how to prioritize his own desires over our collective well-being. Understanding this history was essential for making sense of where we had arrived. The text message was shocking not because it was unprecedented, but because it made explicit what had been implicit in Marcus's behavior for some time. He viewed me as support staff for his life rather than as an equal partner in our shared life. He believed his needs and goals were more important than mine, his judgment superior to mine, his freedom to pursue personal interests unencumbered by obligation to consider how his choices affected me. That understanding would prove crucial in the coming months as I discovered the full extent of what Marcus had been hiding, and as I developed strategy for responding to betrayal that extended far beyond a career change and an expectation of financial support. The foundation we had built during our early partnership would also prove relevant, because it established that I was capable of strategic thinking and careful planning when circumstances required those skills. I had simply not needed to apply them within my marriage until Marcus's behavior made such application necessary. The woman who had built a life with Marcus during those early years of genuine partnership was still present beneath the layers of accommodation and conflict avoidance I had adopted. She was still capable of clear thinking and decisive action. She simply needed sufficient reason to overcome her preference for harmony and her investment in preserving relationship, even when that relationship no longer served her well-being. Marcus's text message had provided that reason. The coming weeks would provide comprehensive evidence that my instincts about something being fundamentally wrong were not paranoia but rather accurate assessment of circumstances Marcus had been deliberately concealing. And eventually, the woman who had once built a partnership based on equality and mutual respect would demonstrate that she was equally capable of dismantling arrangements that had become exploitative and dishonest. But that demonstration was still in the future. First came the investigation that would reveal truth. First came the patient documentation of evidence that would make denial impossible. First came the strategic preparation that would transform justified anger into effective action. The journey from the coffee shop meeting 7 years earlier to the confrontation that would eventually expose Marcus's deception was not a straight line but rather a gradual process of investing in partnership, watching that partnership deteriorate, questioning whether the deterioration was my imagination or reality, and finally acknowledging that my concerns were legitimate and that I deserved better treatment than I was receiving. Each phase was necessary for understanding how we had arrived at crisis, and for developing the strength to respond effectively rather than simply accepting whatever Marcus decided our future would be. The first full week of Marcus's unemployment established patterns that would characterize the following months and provide crucial evidence about what was actually happening beneath the surface explanations he offered. I watched these patterns emerge with growing unease, documenting observations in my private tracking system, while maintaining the appearance of supportive acceptance he seemed to expect from me. Marcus's daily routine during that initial week bore little resemblance to someone seriously exploring career options or engaging in productive self-reflection. He slept later than he had during his working years, usually not emerging from our bedroom until after I had already left for school at 7 in the morning. When I returned home in the late afternoon, he was typically either out of the house entirely or ensconced in our home office with the door closed, claiming to be researching possibilities or taking online courses, though I never saw evidence of actual enrollment or completion of any structured learning program. His explanations for his whereabouts during the day were consistently vague in ways that raised questions he seemed unwilling to address directly. When I asked what he had worked on during the hours I was at school, he would offer general statements about exploring different industries or reaching out to contacts about potential opportunities. When I requested specifics about which industries or which contacts, he would become defensive about my need to monitor his activities, reframing reasonable questions as expressions of distrust or excessive control. The financial aspects of this first week were particularly revealing. Despite his assertions that we needed to dramatically reduce spending to accommodate living on my salary alone, Marcus's personal expenditures showed no corresponding adjustment. He continued going to his expensive gym daily, meeting friends for meals at restaurants we could not realistically afford on my income, and making purchases that appeared on our shared credit card without prior discussion or justification. When I pointed out the disconnect between his stated commitment to financial restraint and his actual spending patterns, Marcus claimed these expenses were investments in maintaining his professional network and his mental health during a stressful transition. He suggested I was being petty by tracking small expenditures instead of trusting him to manage his own needs appropriately. The fact that these needs were being funded by credit cards I would ultimately be responsible for paying apparently did not factor into his assessment of what constituted reasonable autonomy. I began noticing other changes in Marcus's behavior that suggested his explanation about needing time to explore career options was at best incomplete. His phone habits became even more secretive than they had been during his final months of employment. He kept the device with him constantly, taking it into the bathroom when he showered and positioning it face down on every surface to prevent me from seeing incoming notifications. When calls came through, he would frequently step outside or move to another room before answering, offering no explanation about why privacy was necessary for conversations he claimed were with former colleagues or recruiters. His computer usage followed similar patterns of heightened security consciousness. He had always been reasonably private about his devices, which I had attributed to handling confidential business information during his corporate career. But now that he was no longer employed and presumably no longer dealing with sensitive proprietary material, his protective behavior around his laptop actually intensified rather than relaxing. He closed applications quickly when I entered the room, angled screens away from my potential view, and had clearly changed passwords to prevent me from accessing his accounts even for legitimate household purposes like checking our shared calendar. The evening hours revealed perhaps the most significant departure from what I would have expected if Marcus were genuinely focused on career transition and personal development. Rather than using this time to work on the novel he had mentioned or to take online courses he claimed to be considering, he was frequently out of the house during hours when productive networking or job searching would not typically occur. He would leave after dinner claiming he needed to clear his head or meet up with friends, returning late in the evening with explanations that felt increasingly rehearsed and thin. When he was home during evenings, Marcus spent substantial time messaging on his phone with an intensity and frequency that suggested ongoing conversations rather than occasional check-ins with contacts. His facial expressions while engaged in these exchanges ranged from amused to excited to occasionally frustrated, emotional responses that seemed disproportionate if the conversations were merely about career possibilities or casual catch-ups with former colleagues. Several times I observed him smiling at his phone screen in ways that conveyed intimacy or pleasure, reactions that created uncomfortable questions about who might be generating such responses. I found myself studying my husband as though he were a stranger whose behavior required analysis rather than someone I had known intimately for 7 years. The observation felt both necessary and deeply sad, recognition that I could no longer take Marcus's explanations at face value, and needed to verify through evidence rather than trust. This shift from partnership based on mutual honesty to investigation based on suspicion marked a fundamental change in our relationship that would prove difficult to reverse, even if we managed to resolve the immediate crisis. My teaching work provided helpful structure during this period of uncertainty and investigation. The predictability of classroom routines and the straightforward needs of my students offered relief from the complexity and deception that seemed to characterize my home life. I threw myself into lesson planning and student engagement with renewed energy, finding satisfaction in environments where expectations were clear and communication was direct, rather than coded and evasive. Several of my colleagues noticed something was different about my demeanor, though I deflected their gentle inquiries with vague statements about stress at home that I was working through. My closest friend at Roosevelt Elementary, another fifth-grade teacher named Carmen Rodriguez, was more persistent in her concern and eventually extracted enough information that I confessed about Marcus quitting his job and expecting me to support us financially while he figured out his next steps. Carmen's response was immediate and unambiguous. She leaned back in her chair in the teacher's lounge where we were eating lunch during our brief break from classroom duties, her expression communicating volumes about what she thought of Marcus's plan. Her next words confirmed what her face had already conveyed. When a man quits his job without warning and immediately expects his wife to carry all financial responsibility, while he takes indefinite time off, that raises serious questions about what else is happening that he is not telling you. I had been thinking similar thoughts, but hearing them articulated by someone whose judgment I trusted made them harder to dismiss as paranoid speculation. Carmen asked whether I had noticed other changes in Marcus's behavior beyond the employment situation, and I found myself describing the phone secrecy, the vague explanations about his daily activities, the late evening absences, the defensive reactions to reasonable questions. Listing these observations aloud made their collective significance more obvious than when they existed as separate concerns I was trying to rationalize individually. Carmen suggested something I had been reluctant to consider seriously despite my sister Lauren having raised similar possibilities. She said that in her experience, which included having been through her own divorce several years earlier, when someone suddenly needs substantial freedom and becomes secretive about their activities while maintaining high personal spending, they are often supporting something they do not want their partner to know about. That something could be an addiction, an affair, financial problems more serious than they are admitting, or some combination of concerning behaviors that required concealment. The conversation forced me to articulate a question I had been avoiding. What would I do if I discovered Marcus was hiding something significant beyond simple career dissatisfaction? Would I confront him immediately with whatever evidence I found, or would I document comprehensively before revealing my knowledge? Would I view serious deception as grounds for ending the marriage, or would I attempt to work through betrayal in the interest of preserving our partnership? I did not have clear answers to these questions, which probably indicated I was not ready for the potential answers my investigation might uncover. But Carmen's advice was pragmatic and ultimately persuasive. She encouraged me to gather information before making any major decisions, to protect myself financially by understanding our complete situation, and to consult with professionals including an attorney who could advise me about my rights and options regardless of whether I ultimately chose to pursue separation. The suggestion to consult an attorney felt premature and almost like betrayal of my marriage vows, an acknowledgement that I was preparing for potential divorce rather than working to preserve our relationship. But Carmen pointed out that understanding my legal position did not commit me to any particular course of action. It simply ensured I would be making decisions based on complete information about implications and possibilities, rather than operating from ignorance that might disadvantage me if circumstances deteriorated further. That afternoon I searched online for family law attorneys in our area who specialized in complex financial situations. The search itself felt transgressive, like I was crossing a line from concerned spouse to adversary preparing for conflict. But I reminded myself that Marcus had already crossed significant lines by making unilateral decisions that affected both of us, by concealing information about his activities, and by establishing expectations that placed all burden and sacrifice on me, while he pursued undefined personal goals without accountability. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney named Patricia Chun, whose website and reviews suggested she was both competent and compassionate, capable of providing clear legal guidance without unnecessarily escalating conflict. The appointment was set for the following week during my planning period, when I could leave school briefly without requiring substitute coverage. I told no one about the consultation except Carmen, who offered to cover my classroom if any emergency extended my absence beyond the scheduled time. Meanwhile, My documentation of Marcus's activities was revealing patterns that became more concerning the longer I observed them. His daily departures from the house were remarkably consistent in timing, usually occurring mid-morning after I had left for school, and extending through most of the afternoon. He would return shortly before I typically arrived home, often appearing recently showered and wearing different clothes than he had been wearing at breakfast. When I asked casually about his day, his descriptions were consistently generic, mentioning research and networking without ever providing verifiable details about specific people he had met with or concrete progress toward any defined goal. His evening absences followed a pattern as well, occurring 3 to 4 times per week and lasting anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. He would claim various justifications including meeting former colleagues for drinks, attending networking events in his industry, or simply needing time alone to clear his mind and process his thoughts about future direction. But when I asked follow-up questions about these outings such as who specifically he had met with or what venue had hosted the networking event, Marcus would provide vague responses that were difficult to verify, and would become irritated that I apparently needed to track his every movement. The credit card statements I reviewed online told a story that contradicted Marcus's explanations about financial restraint. Charges appeared almost daily at restaurants and coffee shops, many of them located in neighborhoods we rarely visited, and had no obvious connection to Marcus's stated networking activities. There were purchases at clothing stores and electronics retailers, spending on entertainment and leisure activities, and regular charges at his expensive gym that alone consumed a substantial portion of what we supposedly could afford on my salary. I began taking screenshots of these statements and organizing them in my private tracking document, creating a comprehensive record of the disconnect between Marcus's words about tightening our budget and his actions that showed no reduction in personal spending. The evidence was building into a pattern that suggested either Marcus was completely disconnected from financial reality, or he had resources he was not disclosing that allowed him to maintain his lifestyle despite no longer receiving a paycheck. The possibility of undisclosed resources opened additional concerning questions. Had Marcus been hiding money during his employment, secretly diverting portions of his salary into accounts I knew nothing about? Was he receiving financial support from someone else that would explain his confidence about extended unemployment and continued spending? Were there financial arrangements he had made without my knowledge that affected our household situation in ways I needed to understand? I expanded my investigation to include closer examination of our financial accounts and documents. I reviewed our tax returns from previous years, noting that they showed only the income sources I knew about, and did not suggest hidden earnings or undisclosed accounts. I checked our credit reports to see whether Marcus had opened new credit cards or loans without my knowledge, discovering nothing unexpected, though recognizing this did not prove the absence of financial arrangements that might not appear on consumer credit reports. The home office that Marcus spent so much time in with the door closed became a source of intense curiosity. What was he actually doing during those hours when he claimed to be researching career options or working on personal projects? I had respected his privacy during his employment, understanding that he sometimes needed to handle confidential work matters from home, and that I had no business examining his professional materials. But now that he was not employed and was supposedly exploring general possibilities rather than handling sensitive information, his insistence on absolute privacy seemed less justifiable. One afternoon when Marcus had left the house for one of his regular multi-hour absences, I made the decision to examine his office space more thoroughly than the casual glances I had been limiting myself to previously. I felt guilty about violating his privacy even as I recognized that his behavior had created legitimate justification for wanting to understand what he was concealing. The guilt was outweighed by the conviction that I needed actual information, rather than continuing to operate based on incomplete explanations and growing suspicion. The office was neat and organized in ways that suggested Marcus was maintaining appearances of productivity. His desk held his laptop, currently closed and presumably locked with passwords I did not know. There were notepads with occasional scribbled notes that appeared to be lists of companies or contact names, but provided no real context about what these references meant, or what action Marcus was taking related to them. The bookshelf held business texts and industry publications he had accumulated during his corporate career, arranged in ways that looked impressive, but showed no evidence of recent use. I opened the desk drawers carefully, trying to ensure I would be able to return everything to its exact position to avoid Marcus realizing his space had been examined. The drawers contained mostly mundane items including office supplies, old business cards from his previous employment, printed articles about market trends that appeared never to have been read based on their pristine condition, and folders with documents related to household finances and insurance policies. One folder caught my attention because it was labeled simply with Marcus's initials, rather than any descriptive title. Inside were bank statements for an account I had never seen before, showing regular deposits over the past 8 months, and a current balance of approximately $37,000. The account was in Marcus's name alone, opened at a bank we did not typically use for our household finances. The deposits varied in amount but occurred with suspicious regularity, suggesting systematic diversion of funds rather than occasional transfers for specific purposes. I photographed every page of these statements with my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I documented evidence that Marcus had been hiding substantial assets while claiming we needed to live on my salary alone. $37,000 would have covered our household expenses for nearly a year. Yet Marcus had said nothing about this account when presenting his plan for me to support us financially during his unemployment. The concealment was not accidental oversight, but deliberate deception about our true financial position. The discovery transformed my understanding of what was happening. This was not about a man experiencing career burnout and needing time to figure out his next professional move. This was about someone who had been systematically preparing for something that required hidden resources and plausible cover story about needing financial support from his wife. The question was what exactly Marcus had been preparing for, and why he needed both the hidden money and the appearance of depending on me. I returned everything to its exact position and left the office, closing the door carefully behind me. My mind was racing through implications and possibilities, none of them suggesting innocent explanations for what I had discovered. Marcus had not simply quit his job impulsively as his text message had implied. He had been planning something that required accumulating hidden funds over months, establishing a narrative about career dissatisfaction and need for time to explore options, and positioning himself to claim financial dependence on me, while actually maintaining substantial resources I supposedly knew nothing about. The hidden account raised urgent questions about what else Marcus might be concealing. If he had been secretly diverting money for 8 months, what other preparations might he have been making during that time? Were there other accounts I had not yet discovered? Had he been consulting with attorneys or financial planners about protecting his assets in ways that disadvantaged me? Was there someone else involved who knew about these arrangements and was supporting or benefiting from whatever Marcus was planning? My consultation with Patricia Chan the following week took on greater urgency given what I had discovered. I brought printed copies of the bank statements I had photographed along with our household financial records and the tracking document I had been maintaining about Marcus's activities and spending. Patricia reviewed the materials with practiced efficiency, asking clarifying questions and taking notes that would inform her analysis of my situation and my options. Her assessment was blunt. The hidden account combined with Marcus's behavior pattern suggested he was preparing either to leave the marriage while trying to minimize what he would owe in divorce settlement, or to establish some alternative living arrangement that he wanted to fund with concealed assets while maintaining access to marital property and potentially to my income through spousal support claims. Either scenario represented serious financial misconduct that courts would view unfavorably if properly documented and presented. Patricia recommended I continue gathering evidence while taking immediate steps to protect my interests. She advised me to open my own separate bank account and begin diverting a portion of my paycheck into it before Marcus could claim those funds were needed for household expenses. She suggested I secure copies of all important documents including tax returns, insurance policies, mortgage statements, and vehicle titles, storing them somewhere Marcus could not access or destroy them. She emphasized the importance of documenting everything I observed, creating a contemporaneous record that would be more credible than later attempts to recall events from memory. Most importantly, Patricia explained that Washington state was a community property state, meaning that assets accumulated during marriage were generally presumed to belong equally to both spouses regardless of whose name was on the account or who had earned the income. Marcus's attempt to hide money in an account bearing only his name did not give him sole ownership of those funds. If we divorced, I would be entitled to half the value of that account along with half the value of all other marital property. His concealment was essentially stealing from me. diverting community assets into his exclusive control, while claiming financial hardship that justified my supporting him. Patricia also raised the possibility that Marcus's hidden account might be funding something specific, such as another relationship or a business venture he had not disclosed. She suggested I consider whether there were signs beyond the financial evidence that Marcus was involved in activities or relationships I did not know about. Her question prompted me to articulate observations I had been trying not to think about too directly, including his improved attention to physical appearance, his secretive phone behaviors, his regular absences during hours when legitimate networking would not typically occur, and his emotional distance from me even as he remained energized and engaged with whatever occupied his attention during his time away from home. The consultation concluded with Patricia agreeing to represent me if I decided to pursue divorce or legal separation, and with her providing clear guidance about next steps I should take regardless of whether I ultimately chose to end the marriage. I left her office feeling simultaneously relieved to have professional guidance and overwhelmed by the scope of deception I was apparently dealing with. What had started as shock about an unexpected text message had evolved into recognition that Marcus had been systematically lying about fundamental aspects of our financial situation, and quite possibly about other matters I had not yet uncovered. That evening I watched Marcus with new awareness, observing how he positioned his phone to prevent me from seeing the screen, noting how he smiled while typing messages to someone during what should have been our shared dinner time, registering how he seemed anxious to leave the house shortly after we finished eating. Every behavior that I had been trying to interpret charitably now appeared in harsher light, evidence not of innocent career transition but of deliberate concealment and preparation for something he had no intention of discussing with me honestly. The deterioration of our marriage had been gradual enough that I had been able to rationalize individual changes as normal adjustments or temporary stress responses. But viewing the past 2 years comprehensively rather than as isolated incidents revealed a clear pattern of Marcus systematically reducing his investment in our partnership, while increasing his entitlement to resources, and his insistence on autonomy without accountability. He had been preparing for something, building towards some goal or arrangement that required him to establish financial independence through hidden assets while maintaining the appearance of depending on me. The question was what exactly he had been preparing for, and whether I was about to discover that his deceptions extended far beyond secret bank accounts and vague explanations about his daily activities. The warning signs were multiplying faster than I could fully process them, each new observation adding to a picture that suggested my marriage was not experiencing temporary difficulty, but rather was fundamentally broken in ways that might prove impossible to repair. But before making any irrevocable decisions, I needed complete information about what I was actually facing. I needed to understand the full scope of Marcus's concealment and deception. I needed evidence that would support whatever actions I ultimately decided were necessary to protect myself, and to ensure appropriate accountability for serious betrayal. The investigation was just beginning. The discoveries would get worse before they provided the clarity I needed. And the confrontation that would eventually expose everything Marcus had been hiding was still months away, waiting for the perfect moment when his confidence was highest and his guard was completely down. 3 weeks into Marcus's unemployment, I received an unexpected text message that would provide the catalyst for understanding what he had actually been planning. The message arrived on a Friday afternoon while I was supervising my students during their library period, a rare 45 minutes when another staff member was responsible for instruction, and I could catch up on administrative tasks and lesson planning for the following week. The text came from a number I did not recognize, though the area code indicated it was local. The message was brief and confusing in its assumption of familiarity with information I did not possess. Looking forward to celebrating with you both tomorrow evening. Marcus said you were excited about the announcement. See you at Belmont Reserve at 7. I stared at the message, reading it multiple times while trying to make sense of what announcement it might be referring to, and why Marcus had apparently told someone I was excited about something I knew nothing about. Belmont Reserve was an exclusive event venue located on the waterfront, known for hosting high-end weddings and corporate functions. The location alone suggested whatever was happening tomorrow evening was formal and carefully planned, not a casual gathering among friends. I texted back asking who was sending the message and what event they were referring to, trying to gather information without revealing my complete ignorance about plans that apparently involved me. The response came quickly. Sorry, this is Jennifer Whitmore, Marcus's sister. I thought he would have told you by now. See you tomorrow. Jennifer, Marcus's younger sister who lived in Seattle, and whom we saw perhaps twice a year during holidays or family celebrations. I had not spoken with her in at least 3 months, and Marcus had not mentioned that she was planning to visit or that any event involving his family was being organized. The fact that Jennifer assumed I knew about tomorrow's gathering, and that Marcus had told her I was excited about some unspecified announcement created immediate alarm about what was actually being planned. I waited until I returned home that afternoon to ask Marcus directly about the message I had received from his sister. He was in the living room when I arrived, lounging on the couch with his laptop and appearing relaxed despite the fact that he had now been unemployed for 3 weeks with no visible progress toward any defined goal. His expression shifted slightly when I mentioned Jennifer's text, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or concern before his features settled back into casual neutrality. "Oh, I was going to tell you about that this evening," Marcus said, his tone suggesting this was a minor detail he had simply not gotten around to mentioning rather than a significant event he had deliberately concealed. "Some of the family is coming into town, and I thought it would be nice to get everyone together for dinner. Nothing major, just a chance to catch up since we have not seen people in a while." His explanation was plausible on its surface but raised immediate questions given what Jennifer had said about an announcement and what I knew about Belmont Reserve as a venue. Family dinners did not typically require reservations at exclusive waterfront locations, and Jennifer's message had specifically referenced celebrating and an announcement rather than simply catching up. Marcus was clearly minimizing whatever was actually planned for tomorrow evening, presenting it as casual and spontaneous when the logistics suggested it was formal and had been arranged well in advance. "Jennifer mentioned an announcement," I said carefully, watching Marcus's face for reactions that might reveal what he was concealing. "What is she referring to? What are we announcing?" Marcus's hesitation was brief but noticeable, a momentary pause while he apparently decided how to respond to direct questioning about something he had clearly hoped to control the timing and framing of. "I was thinking about sharing some of my plans for the next phase of my career," he said finally. "Nothing is finalized yet, but I wanted to get the family's input and support. It seemed like a good opportunity to bring everyone together and talk about possibilities." The explanation made no sense given what I knew about Marcus's actual activities during the past 3 weeks, which had consisted primarily of vague networking and unexplained absences rather than concrete career planning. He had not shared any specific plans with me despite my repeated requests for clarity about what he was working toward and what timeline we were operating under. Now he was claiming he wanted family input about possibilities he had not bothered to discuss with his actual wife, who was currently supporting him financially. "What plans specifically?" I asked, maintaining a tone of interested curiosity rather than accusatory suspicion despite my growing certainty that Marcus was lying about the true purpose of tomorrow's gathering. "You have not mentioned anything concrete to me about next steps. I would think we should discuss your plans together before involving extended family in conversations about your career direction." Marcus stood from the couch with visible irritation, clearly uncomfortable with questioning he had not anticipated. "This is exactly why I have not wanted to discuss every detail with you before I am ready. You immediately start interrogating me and questioning my judgment instead of just being supportive. I am allowed to think through options and get input from people I trust without clearing every conversation with you first." The defensive response was revealing in multiple ways. It reframed my reasonable questions about plans that apparently involved me and our financial future as excessive control and lack of trust. It positioned his family as people he trusted for input in ways that implicitly suggested I was not in that category. Most significantly, it avoided actually answering what specific plans he intended to announce, and why a formal dinner at an expensive venue was necessary for discussing career possibilities. I recognized that pushing harder in this moment would only make Marcus more defensive and more careful about what he revealed. If something significant was happening tomorrow evening, I needed to attend that gathering with full awareness that Marcus was concealing important information, and with preparation to respond appropriately to whatever he had orchestrated. Confronting him now about the inconsistencies in his explanation would only alert him that I was questioning his narrative. "I am not interrogating you," I said, keeping my voice level and conciliatory even as my mind was racing through implications. I was surprised to hear about plans from your sister rather than from you. And I wanted to understand what we are doing tomorrow so I can be prepared. That seems reasonable given that Jennifer is expecting both of us to attend. Marcus relaxed slightly at my apparent acceptance, though wariness remained in his expression. Wear something nice, he said. Belmont Reserve is a formal venue and I want us to look put together. This is important for how my family perceives where we are in our lives. The comment about appearances and how his family perceived us echoed similar statements Marcus had been making for the past 2 years about image and presentation. But now those concerns about appearances took on more sinister implications given what I knew about his hidden bank account and his pattern of deception. Whatever was happening tomorrow was not simply a family dinner. It was a performance Marcus had carefully staged, and my role in that performance was apparently something he expected me to play without full knowledge of the script. I called my sister Lauren that evening after Marcus had gone to his regular Friday night outing with unspecified friends, needing to process what had happened, and to get perspective from someone whose judgment I trusted completely. Lauren listened to my description of Jennifer's message and Marcus's subsequent explanation with growing concern that was audible even through the phone connection. He is planning something significant and he does not want you to know the details in advance because he wants to control how you react in front of his family, Lauren said after I finished explaining the situation. That is what this is about. He has orchestrated some kind of announcement and he is counting on you being too surprised or too concerned about appearances to push back effectively when whatever he has planned gets revealed in front of witnesses. Her assessment aligned with my own suspicions, but hearing it articulated so directly made the situation feel more real and more threatening. What do? I asked, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the scope of deception I was apparently dealing with. Do I refuse to go? Do I confront him before tomorrow? Do I just show up and see what happens? Lauren's advice was strategic and ultimately persuasive. She suggested I attend the dinner because whatever Marcus had planned would happen with or without my presence, and being there would at least allow me to respond directly rather than hearing about it secondhand. She recommended I prepare myself emotionally for the possibility that the announcement might be something devastating, such as Marcus declaring he wanted a divorce or revealing plans to move away, or some other major decision he had made without consulting me. Most importantly, Lauren suggested I consider inviting someone to attend with me as support, someone who could provide a friendly face in what might become a hostile environment, and who could serve as witness to whatever occurred. She offered to drive down herself if I wanted her there, willing to sacrifice her weekend plans to ensure I had an ally during what was likely to be a difficult evening. The offer was tempting but presented practical complications. If Lauren attended, Marcus would know I had been suspicious enough about his plans to bring reinforcement, which might make him more guarded about whatever he had orchestrated. But attending alone meant facing whatever Marcus had planned without any support system present, potentially isolated among his family members who would likely side with him if conflict emerged. I ultimately decided to attend alone but to prepare thoroughly for multiple possible scenarios. I would dress appropriately for the formal venue as Marcus had requested, maintaining the appearance of being a supportive spouse who was participating in family celebration. But I would also go into the evening with full awareness that Marcus was concealing important information, and with mental preparation to respond strategically rather than emotionally to whatever announcement he had planned. Saturday morning brought additional concerning developments. Marcus was energized and focused in ways I had not observed during the previous weeks of his unemployment, clearly anticipating something significant about the evening ahead. He spent unusual amounts of time on his appearance, trying on multiple outfits before settling on an expensive suit I had not seen him wear previously. He was on his phone constantly throughout the day, messaging with intensity that suggested coordination with multiple parties about logistics or timing or other details of whatever had been planned. Around midday, I received another text message, this time from Marcus's mother Diane. Your news is wonderful, sweetheart. We are so proud of both of you. See you tonight. The message was warm and congratulatory, clearly responding to some information she had been given about Marcus and me that I had no knowledge of. Whatever news she was referring to was not something I had been consulted about or agreed to, yet Diane believed it represented shared plans that warranted pride and celebration. The message confirmed that Marcus had been communicating with his family about developments in our lives without including me in those communications, or ensuring the information being shared was accurate. He had apparently told his mother and presumably other family members some version of events that presented whatever he was planning as joint decisions or shared goals, when the reality was that I had been deliberately excluded from the planning process. I forwarded Diane's message to Lauren with a brief note expressing my growing anxiety about what the evening might bring. Lauren responded immediately with encouragement and practical advice. She suggested I keep my phone charged and accessible throughout the dinner, maintaining the ability to communicate with her if circumstances became overwhelming, or if I needed support. She also recommended I consider how I would respond to various possible announcements, thinking through my reaction in advance rather than being caught completely unprepared. The afternoon passed slowly as I attempted to prepare myself mentally for scenarios I could only partially imagine. What announcement could Marcus be planning that would warrant gathering his family at an expensive venue, that would elicit congratulations from his mother, that he wanted to reveal publicly rather than discussing with me privately first? The possibilities ranged from relatively benign, such as announcing he had accepted a new job opportunity, to concerning such as declaring he was starting a business that would require additional financial investment from me, to devastating such as revealing he wanted to end our marriage or had made unilateral decisions about our future that fundamentally altered our partnership. I dressed carefully for the evening in a navy dress that was formal enough for the venue but not so elaborate that I would appear to be celebrating if the announcement turned out to be something I could not support. I kept my jewelry simple and my makeup natural, wanting to present as composed and dignified regardless of what the evening brought. Marcus noticed my outfit when I emerged from our bedroom and nodded approval, apparently satisfied that I looked appropriate for whatever he had planned. We drove to Belmont Reserve in Marcus's Audi, the silence between us heavy with unspoken tension. Marcus seemed increasingly nervous as we got closer to the venue, his hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly than necessary, and his jaw clenched in ways that suggested he was mentally rehearsing whatever he intended to say or do during the evening. I attempted casual conversation about neutral topics, but his responses were distracted and monosyllabic, his attention clearly focused on what was coming rather than on present-moment interaction with me. Belmont Reserve was even more impressive than I had anticipated. An elegant building of glass and natural wood situated on a bluff overlooking the harbor. The early evening light reflected off the water in shades of gold and amber, creating a backdrop that would have been romantic under different circumstances. The venue's main dining room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the water view, tables set with fine linens and crystal glassware, and lighting designed to create ambience without overwhelming the natural beauty of the setting. Marcus's family members were already gathered when we arrived, approximately 15 people representing his parents, his sister Jennifer and her husband, his brother Daniel and his wife and their 2 teenage children, several aunts and uncles I had met occasionally over the years, and a few people I did not immediately recognize. Everyone seemed to be in celebratory moods, greeting us with smiles and knowing looks that suggested they were all aware of whatever announcement was coming, while I remained deliberately uninformed. Diane embraced me with warmth that felt genuine, telling me how happy she was and how excited the whole family was about our news. Her enthusiasm would have been touching if I had any idea what news she was referring to or why she believed I was equally excited about developments I knew nothing about. I smiled and thanked her for coming, playing the role of gracious host despite having no actual knowledge of what was being celebrated or why this gathering had been organized. We were seated at a long table positioned to take advantage of the window view, place cards indicating where each person should sit. I found myself positioned near the center of the table with Marcus immediately to my right, his parents across from us, and other family members arranged in ways that suggested someone had carefully considered the seating arrangement for maximum impact during whatever announcement was planned. The formality of the setup reinforced my certainty that this was not a casual family dinner, but rather a staged event where my reactions would be witnessed by everyone present. Drinks were served and appetizers appeared while conversation flowed around topics that felt superficial given the undercurrent of anticipation that permeated the gathering. People asked polite questions about my teaching work and Marcus's transition from his corporate position, their inquiries carefully avoiding any specifics that might reveal whether they actually understood our current situation, or were simply following social scripts about appropriate dinner conversation. Approximately 30 minutes into the meal, Marcus stood and tapped his water glass with his knife, the sound drawing everyone's attention to him. The room quieted immediately, all eyes turning toward Marcus with expectant expressions that confirmed they were waiting for this moment. for whatever announcement he had gathered them to witness. My stomach tightened with anxiety about what was coming, every instinct warning me that I was not going to like what Marcus was about to say. Marcus began speaking with confidence that suggested extensive rehearsal of his remarks. He thanked everyone for coming and expressed appreciation for the family support he had always received throughout his life and career. He acknowledged that the past few weeks had been a time of transition and reflection, as he had made the decision to leave his corporate position and explore new directions for his professional life. He spoke about the importance of family and the value of having loved ones who believed in you during periods of change and uncertainty. Then he turned to me with a smile that would have appeared loving to anyone who did not know that I had no idea what he was about to announce. He said that none of his plans would be possible without my unwavering support and my willingness to stand beside him as he pursued his dreams. He said I had always been his rock and his inspiration, the person who made him believe he could achieve anything he set his mind to. The words were calculated to position me as supportive partner in whatever he was about to reveal, creating public expectation that I would enthusiastically embrace plans I had not been consulted about. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew several printed pages, unfolding them with theatrical care that suggested this was the climax of his prepared performance. He announced that he had been accepted into a prestigious executive MBA program in Vancouver, British Columbia. That would begin in 6 weeks, and would require him to relocate to Canada for the 18-month duration of the intensive program. He said this was an incredible opportunity to develop new skills and connections that would position him for even greater success when he completed the program and returned to the workforce. The family erupted in applause and congratulations, clearly viewing this announcement as exciting news worthy of celebration. Marcus's parents were beaming with pride about their son's acceptance into a competitive program. Jennifer was already asking questions about when we would be moving, and whether we plan to keep our house in the States or establish permanent residence in Vancouver. Other family members were offering support and enthusiasm, treating the announcement as though it represented positive development for both of us rather than unilateral decision Marcus had made without consulting me. I sat frozen in my chair, processing information that recontextualized everything I had observed during the past 3 weeks. Marcus had not been exploring career options or engaging in productive self-reflection. He had been planning to leave the country for 18 months, to pursue an expensive graduate program without discussing it with me, to make decisions that affected both of our lives without including me in the planning process. The hidden bank account suddenly made more sense as preparation for funding his life in Vancouver. His vague explanations about his daily activities were probably concealing preparation for international relocation, including securing housing and managing visa requirements. The announcement explained why Marcus had quit his job, and why he had framed it as needing time to get his life together rather than being honest about his actual plans. If he had told me from the beginning that he wanted to attend graduate school in another country, we could have discussed whether that was financially feasible, whether the timing was appropriate, whether I was willing to either relocate with him or manage a long-distance marriage for 18 months while also shouldering all our financial obligations. But by concealing his plans until this moment when his entire family was present and expecting me to be thrilled, Marcus had eliminated the possibility of genuine discussion about whether this was something I could support. Every family member was now looking at me expectantly, waiting for my reaction to news they believed I should be celebrating. Marcus was watching me with an expression that combined confidence and warning, clearly expecting me to play the role of supportive wife despite having just learned that my husband had planned to leave the country without properly consulting me about decisions that fundamentally affected our partnership and our future. The moment crystallized everything wrong with our marriage into a single tableau. Marcus standing confidently with his announcement papers. His family applauding his acceptance into a program that would take him away for 18 months. Everyone expecting me to smile and congratulate him on plans that would require me to support him financially, while he pursued his ambitions in another country. The complete absence of any genuine partnership or mutual decision-making about major life choices. I understood suddenly that this gathering was not really about celebrating Marcus's opportunity. It was about establishing public narrative that I had supported his decision and was enthusiastically on board with his plans, creating witnesses who would later confirm that I had been part of this choice rather than having it imposed on me without consultation. Marcus had orchestrated this announcement specifically to trap me into public acceptance of plans I had never agreed to, counting on my unwillingness to cause a scene in front of his family to prevent me from objecting to the fundamental dishonesty of how he was presenting our situation. The realization brought surprising clarity about what I needed to do. I could play along with Marcus's performance, maintain the appearance of supportive partnership, and deal with my actual feelings and concerns privately. That was clearly what he expected and what his family was anticipating. It was the path of least resistance and least immediate conflict. Or I could refuse to participate in the fiction he had created. I could acknowledge publicly that this announcement was news to me as well, that Marcus had not discussed these plans with me before accepting admission to a program in another country, that we had not made joint decisions about whether this was feasible or appropriate given our current circumstances. That path would create immediate conflict, and would require me to accept being seen as unsupportive or difficult by people whose opinions might matter to Marcus, but who did not fully understand our actual situation. The choice between accommodation and honesty played out in my mind during the seconds of silence, while everyone waited for my response. I thought about my students and what I would tell them about standing up for themselves when someone tried to make unilateral decisions that affected them. I thought about my sister Lauren, and what she would say about the importance of truth, even when honesty created discomfort. I thought about the woman I had been during the early years of my relationship with Marcus when partnership and mutual respect had characterized our interactions. That woman would not have accepted being ambushed with major announcements in front of witnesses who expected her to smile and acquiesce without question. That woman would have insisted on genuine consultation about decisions that affected both partners in a marriage. That woman deserved to re-emerge, even if doing so meant exposing the dysfunction that Marcus had been working so hard to conceal behind performances of successful partnership. I stood slowly, every eye in the room tracking my movement as I rose to respond to Marcus's announcement. What I said next would determine whether I continued enabling his pattern of unilateral decision-making and deception, or whether I finally demanded the genuine partnership and respect I had been missing for far too long. The moment felt simultaneously terrifying and clarifying. The beginning of either continued accommodation or the start of fundamental change in how I allowed myself to be treated. I stood at that table in Belmont Reserve with 15 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for the enthusiastic response Marcus had clearly promised them I would deliver. The weight of expectation was palpable in the silence that had fallen after his announcement about the Vancouver MBA program. Every second I remained standing without speaking increased the tension in the room, and the uncertainty on Marcus's face about whether his carefully orchestrated performance was about to unravel in front of his entire family. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured, containing none of the shock or anger churning beneath the surface. I thanked everyone for coming and acknowledged that Marcus's acceptance into the program was certainly an achievement worth recognizing. Then I added carefully that this was actually the first I was hearing about specific plans for Vancouver, that Marcus and I would obviously need to have extensive private discussions about the logistics and feasibility of such a significant commitment, and that I hoped everyone would understand we could not make definitive decisions about 18 months of international relocation during a dinner party without first working through the practical implications together. The response was diplomatic enough to avoid creating immediate confrontation, while making clear that Marcus had misrepresented the situation when he implied I was fully informed and supportive of plans that were apparently already finalized in his mind. The energy in the room shifted perceptibly as family members recognized that something was not quite right about the narrative they had been given. Marcus's confident expression faltered briefly before he recovered and suggested we could discuss details later while everyone enjoyed the meal that had been prepared. The remainder of the dinner was excruciating. Conversation continued around neutral topics while undercurrents of confusion and tension flowed beneath the surface pleasantries. Several family members asked questions clearly designed to understand whether there was conflict between Marcus and me about his plans, their careful wording suggesting they were trying to assess the situation without overtly taking sides. Marcus deflected these inquiries with assurances that we were completely aligned, and that my comment about needing to discuss logistics was simply acknowledgement that complex planning would be required for the transition. I maintained composure throughout the meal despite wanting desperately to leave the venue and confront Marcus privately about the comprehensive deception this announcement represented. He had not simply failed to mention an application to a graduate program. He had systematically concealed plans that would affect every aspect of our lives for at least 18 months, had allowed me to believe his unemployment was about exploring possibilities rather than preparing for a decision he had already made, and had staged a public announcement specifically designed to trap me into appearing supportive of arrangements I had never agreed to. When we finally left Belmont Reserve several hours later, the drive home was conducted in complete silence. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched and his hands tight on the steering wheel. I stared out the passenger window at the darkened streets, processing everything I had learned and what it meant for our marriage and my future. The silence continued as we entered our house, as Marcus went immediately to the home office and closed the door, as I stood alone in our kitchen trying to organize my thoughts into something approaching coherent response strategy. I did not confront Marcus that evening because I recognized that any conversation in our current emotional states would devolve into unproductive argument where he would defend his choices, and I would express hurt and anger without either of us reaching any meaningful resolution. Instead, I went to bed in the guest room, claiming I had a headache and needed space to sleep undisturbed. The truth was that I could not bear to share a bed with someone who had just demonstrated so thoroughly that he viewed our marriage as something he could manipulate for his own purposes without concern for my legitimate right to participate in major decisions affecting both of us. Sunday morning brought no improvement in the tension between us. Marcus emerged from the office where he had apparently spent the night, his appearance suggesting he had not slept well. He attempted to initiate conversation about the previous evening, beginning with defensive justifications about why he had handled the announcement the way he had. According to his explanation, he had not told me about Vancouver earlier because he had not wanted to get my hopes up before he knew whether he would be accepted into the program. He claimed he had planned to discuss everything with me once acceptance was confirmed, but then his family had started asking questions, and it had seemed easier to just gather everyone together for a combined announcement. The explanations were transparently inadequate. Graduate program applications required months of preparation including essays, recommendations, and test scores. Marcus had been working on this application for a substantial period while telling me nothing about his activities or his actual goals. His acceptance had been confirmed at least several days before the dinner, given that he had time to organize the gathering and inform his family members who needed to travel. He could have told me privately at any point during that period, but had chosen instead to ambush me with the information in front of witnesses who would pressure me to respond positively. I told Marcus we needed to have a serious conversation about his plans and about the state of our marriage, but that I needed time to process everything before I could engage productively in that discussion. He seemed relieved by the postponement, probably interpreting my need for time as indication that I would eventually come around to accepting his plans once I adjusted to the surprise of learning about them in such an uncomfortable way. He left the house mid-morning for unspecified activities, giving me several hours alone to think through what I had learned and what additional information I needed before making decisions about how to respond. The Vancouver announcement recontextualized everything I had observed during the previous 3 weeks and raised urgent questions about what else Marcus might be concealing. If he had been planning international relocation while telling me nothing about it, what other preparations might he have made without my knowledge? The hidden bank account I had discovered now appeared to be funding for his life in Vancouver, rather than just concealed assets. But was that account the only one? Or had Marcus been systematically diverting money into multiple hidden locations while claiming we needed to live on my salary alone? I returned to Marcus's office with renewed determination to understand the complete scope of what I was dealing with. His laptop was present but closed and presumably locked with passwords that prevented my access. However, the filing cabinet I had examined previously contained additional folders I had not reviewed thoroughly during my initial search. I began working through these systematically, photographing anything that appeared relevant to our financial situation or to Marcus's plans. One folder contained correspondence from the University of British Columbia Sauder School of Business confirming Marcus's acceptance into their executive MBA program. The letters were dated from 6 weeks earlier, meaning Marcus had known about his acceptance for more than a month before his supposedly spontaneous announcement at Belmont Reserve. The tuition information included in the acceptance packet was staggering. Nearly $90,000 Canadian for the 18-month program plus living expenses in one of the most expensive cities in North America. The financial burden of this program would be substantial even if Marcus had been employed and we had been planning for this expense together. Additional documents revealed that Marcus had already secured student housing in Vancouver beginning in 6 weeks, the same timeline he had mentioned during his announcement. The housing contract was in his name alone and indicated he was renting a studio apartment rather than accommodations that would be suitable for me if I were expected to relocate with him. The implications were clear. Marcus had not been planning for us to move to Vancouver together. He had been planning to go alone, to establish a separate life in another country while presumably expecting me to maintain our house and financial obligations in the States and quite possibly to subsidize his graduate school expenses and living costs. I found the visa application documents Marcus had submitted to Canadian immigration authorities, declaring his intention to study in British Columbia for 18 months. The application made no mention of a spouse accompanying him or any plans to establish household with family members. Again, the documentation confirmed that Marcus had been planning solo relocation rather than joint transition with his wife, who was supposedly his partner in all major life decisions. The most damaging discovery was a series of emails between Marcus and a woman named Sloane Kaufman, who appeared to be a current student in the UBC program. The email exchange stretched back nearly 5 months, predating Marcus's resignation from Vertex Solutions by several months. The early messages were ostensibly about the program requirements and application process, with Sloane answering Marcus's questions about coursework intensity and the Vancouver experience and career outcomes for graduates. But the tone of the correspondence shifted substantially over time, becoming increasingly personal and intimate in ways that suggested a relationship that extended beyond informational mentoring. By the most recent messages, Marcus and Sloane were making plans to spend time together once Marcus arrived in Vancouver, discussing restaurants they wanted to try and hiking trails they could explore together, and how excited Sloane was that Marcus would finally be joining her in the city. The messages included photographs Sloane had sent to Marcus showing scenic views of Vancouver neighborhoods and the UBC campus, but also including several selfies of an attractive woman in her early 30s with dark hair and an athletic build. Marcus had responded to these photos with compliments that went beyond appropriate acknowledgement of helpful information sharing, telling Sloane she looked beautiful and that he could not wait to see her in person rather than just through photographs. I sat in Marcus's office chair photographing email after email that documented a relationship my husband had been conducting with another woman while claiming he needed time to find himself professionally. The correspondence made clear that the Vancouver MBA program was not primarily about educational opportunity or career development. It was about proximity to Sloane Kaufman, about establishing circumstances where Marcus could pursue a relationship that had been developing remotely while he was supposedly committed to our marriage. The hidden bank account, the secretive phone behavior, the regular absences during evening hours, the defensive reactions to reasonable questions about his activities all made sudden sense. Marcus had been preparing to leave our marriage, establishing the financial resources and practical arrangements required to start a new life in another country with another woman. The MBA program provided respectable cover story for the relocation, transforming what was essentially abandonment of his marriage into something that could be framed as career advancement that his wife should support. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.